think a lot about geopolitics and about the Middle East because of where the Suez Canal is. As far as I can tell, ever since I'll take it back as far as World War One, the Ottoman Empire controlled the Levant, essentially. That whole area where Israel is and all that was controlled by the Ottomans, and the Ottomans were on the side of the Germans in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War One. So the British and the French, Sykes and Picot, these two guys, set up an agreement with the Arabs who were populated in that area, serving under the Ottoman Empire. And they got the Arabs, they were like, if you betray the Ottomans, we'll give you this area of the Levant after the war. So the Arabs revolted. And you can look up the Arab Revolt, the Arab Revolution, the Arab Revolt, I think is what it's called, the Arab Revolt. There was one of them in modern history. And the Arabs in 1917, I think it was, shortly after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, they revolted against the Ottomans. The Ottomans swiftly lost the war as a result. And then this British guy, Balfour, came out with this declaration. They call it the Balfour Declaration, saying, actually, we're going to keep this area in the Levant after the war was done. Screwing the Arabs over, reneging on the deal, telling the Arabs, sorry. I don't know if they said sorry. They just said, we're going to set up this mandate over here. We're going to give the northern part of the Levant to the French, like Syria and all that, and the southern part of the area to the British. And they set up what was called the British Mandate for Palestine after World War I. So the British had this mandate of the area, and they controlled the area for 30 years. And then, of course, World War II kicked off. 4 or 5 years, 6 years. When that ended, the British and the French and the Americans, this liberal economic order that was getting formed, had total global domination, total control. They could do whatever they wanted. And what they did was the Soviets also were kind of like the rogue state in this whole operandi, but the Americans took over Germany, Western Germany, particularly West Berlin. They took everything in Western Germany, made it a puppet state. They took over Japan, made it a puppet state. They set up Israel in 1949. I'd say I don't know exactly the transaction, but Israel was set up shortly after the war. So the British Mandate for Palestine became Israel. And as far as I can tell, the obsession with that area of the world and why the British have been so desirous of it in the modern age is because of the Suez Canal, because of that shipping lane and controlling shipping rights and shipping lanes through the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean. So they, and I say this liberal economic order, basically set up Egypt and Saudi Arabia as puppet client states. We overlook their human rights abuses. Is like, whatever you got to do, we'll turn a blind eye, just help us defend and protect the Suez Canal. And so it runs through Egypt. You've got Saudi Arabia there protecting the Gulf of Aden. There's the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea. Those two are connected. It's one of the two. But Saudi Arabia is basically bordering that waterway, and so is Egypt. And so we've got that buffer. We've got the Israeli nuclear buffer to the north. And then the Bush administration took us into conflict in, Iraq, Afghanistan, under false pretenses. They told us that, well, 9/11 is a whole other story. I love going deep on that with architects and engineers, talking about buildings falling in near free fall and, what other military-grade incendiaries found in the dust used to melt steel, like what happened that day. But whatever, it was the weapons of mass destruction that George Bush told us Saddam Hussein had that turned out to be untrue. It was a lie. The Bush administration and the government at the time lied to the American people to get them to go to war in Iraq, and they did. They went for it. They believed the government. And this was kind of the beginning of the end of the belief in the narrative. This is when the belief in the narrative started to rupture. It was after this weapons of mass destruction debacle on the internet, and just constantly impressing this lie that the Bush administration foisted on us. Cheney gets his company Halliburton, as he's the vice president, he gets his company Halliburton set up over there as one of the main defense contractors. Just insidious fascism. And so they took over Iraq, basically. They set it up as a client state, like what they had done with Japan. They attempted to take over Afghanistan. They set up massive amounts of influence in Afghanistan. They have been trying to take over Syria. You might argue that they now have it. because of the Syrian, I don't know if you call it a revolution or revolt or whatever, but there was an attack on Bashar al-Assad last year, roughly 6-8 months ago or something. He was ousted from power. Now there's this, I don't know what the hell's happening in Syria right now, but it's very possible that it's more of a liberal, economic, ordered, friendly area. They took Libya, with the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi. Libya, Hillary Clinton saying, "We came, we saw, he died." Her buddy Sidney Blumenthal setting up Osprey Global Solutions to run guns through the country. They had already planned what to do with the country before Muammar Gaddafi was taken out of power. So Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, they're all kind of serving this liberal economic order. As far as I can tell, it's to protect the Suez. So it's more about my take on what's going on over there and why it's been going on for so long. Solutions: learn Arabic, learn Cyrillic alphabet, learn Russian, create an alliance with the Iranian, Russian, American conglomerate so that we can share the trade route. I don't see, if it's just going to be constant fighting over a trade route, I don't think that can sustain. So we're going to eventually have to find some sort of diplomatic solution if we want to survive it. And what else? That's about it. I was thinking also about Turkey a lot, because the Turks control the Bosphorus Strait through, I want to call it Constantinople, but through Istanbul. And the Russians, as they're taking over the Sevastopol and the Crimea and setting up their Mediterranean shipping lanes now, they're going to be rolling through the Bosphorus Strait, through Turkey. All their shipping is going to go through Turkey. Turkey's in NATO, so Turkey and the United States are allied through NATO. It sort of seems like an opportunity for the Russians and the Americans to come to the table to forge an alliance. You don't have to like someone to be in alliance with them. Forge an alliance, the Americans and the Russians and the Turks. And the Turks can sort of act as a mediator, because they can guarantee safe shipping lanes for the Americans and the Europeans to ship into Russia through the Bosphorus up into Crimea, and they can protect the Russians to ship out of the area into Europe, into the Indian Ocean and so forth. And it could be a very lucrative, super tight alliance. And honestly, if people are afraid of the Chinese, which there's a lot of talk about, China wants Taiwan, China's the biggest threat, you need the Russians on your side. Like, if there was an American-Chinese war, right now, today, if there was a war broke out between the two, I imagine Russia would stay neutral. They would just sit there, like, wait and see. And then if the Chinese are idiot enough to attack them, the Russians would join the Americans. But I mean, the Russians, the reason they would stay neutral and not attack the Chinese if they incited some global conflict is because of everything that's been going on in the Ukraine. I don't imagine the Russian government, Vladimir Putin, has obsessive trust with the Americans right now. Things have been shaky. But also, if you know much about global conflict, a war can end and the next day an alliance can be signed between the two countries that were at war. The land just changes sides. Nobody has animosity. Like, American people don't have animosity with Russian people. When you meet people, they're just people. It's the governments trying to take the land that can be a problem. And of course, the wars that break out are the problem. Another problem, sort of a symptom of a problem. But I think that the Russians and the Americans, it's all just like World War II, man. In this, the Russians they were neutral. They just let the Germans do their thing. The Russians and the Germans had been tight since the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. They'd been working with the Germans through the 1920s and the early 30s to do training missions with, they were testing all their new armored divisions, their motorized infantry, their combined arms tactics and stuff. It was the Germans and the Russians had been working together for a long time leading up to that. But the Russians stayed neutral in the war. And then when they were attacked, of course, by the Germans in Operation Barbarossa, they turned on the Germans and they fought the Germans and joined the Allies, probably out of necessity. I definitely don't think the Russians want a global scale conflict, and that for them to jump. And of course, they know that if they were to join the Americans in some sort of Chinese-American conflict, the Chinese would invade Eastern Russia and it would be just devastating for the Russians. So it's not like they want that. I don't think they want any conflict in that regard. So I can see them staying neutral. But I think it's very important, just as a deterrent, if anything else, to establish extremely tight diplomatic relations between the Russians and the Americans, and to kind of quell this whole I took a piece of land, now you're going to take a piece of, like, the Americans took Iraq. No shit, the Russians are going to take Crimea. And you think that the Chinese now aren't like, well, now we want Taiwan. We each get a piece. You can't just... You know who else I don't think about enough is India. I don't want to tangent too much into something that I'm not too familiar with, but the country of India is extremely influential and powerful. And it's nice that there are revised diplomatics between the Indians and the Americans. That's super, super cool. But I got a lot of faith in the Russian Federation, it being a federation of states. It's still, of course, the holdover from the Soviet mindset, but global peace and stability and calm, whereas people in the West will use the word peace. They want peace. The Russians want calm. That's their version of peace, is calm. So let's strive for peace and calm. All right, crossing out.